Okay, by my sundial, it is 2 p.m. on the East Coast of the United States, which means it is C-Star time. So I'm happy to welcome our audience and our speaker for today. Thanks for joining us. This is the last C-Star talk in our current season. After today's talk, we will be back in August. We haven't picked the date quite yet, but end of August we should be back, and obviously I will send that around again, and you can also monitor our progress on the C-Star website. All that information is on your screen right now. Before I introduce today's speaker, I'm happy to say she has a strong connection with the Academy of Aphasia, where she is on the board. And I want to remind everybody of the deadline for submissions to the Academy of Aphasia conference, which will be held October 24th to 26th, and it's going to be virtual. I will place in the chat box quickly. I'm going to use this in the chat box. I will place, no, I won't. A bit later on, I will place the link to the actual conference. So if you're interested in submitting, please do. May 15th is the deadline. We love to see you online for the Academy of Aphasia in October. Today, I'm really happy to introduce my friend, Dr. Yasmeen Faroqi-Shah. Yasmeen is an associate professor and director of the Aphasia Research Center at the University of Maryland. She obtained her PhD in communication sciences and disorders at Northwestern University with Cindy Thompson in 2004. But I was able to track down her first publication, which is actually from 1997, as far as I could tell, on trace deletion in agrammatism. So very much with the times in 1997. Her current research focuses on sentence production and word retrieval abilities and their breakdown in aphasia. Language learning and training-induced neuroplasticity, and their interaction with bilingualism and cognitive mechanisms. So I'm sure some of those topics will come up today in her talk, Grammatical Encoding in Aphasia. What do we do? What do we know? And how do we move forward? During the talk, you're free to start asking your questions through the chat box. You can just start typing. And I will read those questions out to Yasmeen after the talk. So there's no questions during the talk itself. With that, I give the floor to Dr. Faroqi-Shah.
Thank you, Dirk, for the kind introduction, as well as for inviting me to speak at the C-Star lecture series. I'm looking forward to it, and I actually enjoyed preparing for this talk because it's not a single study, but it's an overview of what we know about agrammatic aphasia. So this talk focuses on expressive agrammatism in post-stroke aphasia. I just wanted to clarify that. So it's not about progressive aphasias or other conditions, but primarily on post-stroke aphasia. I think we are all familiar with the language difficulties that are experienced spoken language difficulties that are experienced by individuals with agrammatic aphasia. Here are some examples of how they speak. And agrammatism has been originally described or defined as a simplification of grammatical structures and omissions of function words and morphemes. Obviously, since then, a lot of research has happened, especially so in the past 4 decades. And this research has kind of focused on 4 different themes: the morphological problems in agrammatic aphasia, verb deficit, asyntactic comprehension issues, as well as difficulty with sentence structure. The question we want to ask today is whether this cluster of symptoms that you see here is unique to agrammatism, expressive agrammatism in post-stroke aphasia. When we look at the literature, we see that these impairments have also been reported in other populations. So other individuals with aphasia who are not classified as having expressive agrammatism. I do want to point out as a disclaimer that you see at the bottom that I'm just presenting only selected citations. I really can't do justice to all the amazing work that has happened in this field. My slides wouldn't fit if that was the case. But the point here is that these symptoms have been reported in other populations as well. And the other challenge that we've had in the field that we need to address going forward is that theories of agrammatic aphasia have been typically focused on one symptom. So again, not doing justice to all the amazing theories that are out there, but they're focused either on just the impaired morphology, and many of these theories have focused on the fact that tense morphemes tend to be more impaired than other kinds of verb and noun morphology in aphasia. Verb deficit, again, the idea being that our high argument verbs are more difficult than low argument verbs. In asyntactic comprehension in the 1980s, there was a focus on moved elements and how those pose comprehension challenges. And then, of course, the fact that complex sentences often have a derived word order different from their deep structure, and that might be causing problems as well. So we have these theories that are specific to a symptom. We don't quite have an overarching theory of expressive agrammatism yet, but there are some notable mentions of overarching theories. One of them being the fact that agrammatism might be an manifestation of the computational load that's required for syntactic computations or grammatical encoding. The premise for this being that the severity of expressive agrammatism differs by task demands. Another similar approach is that people with grammatical encoding impairments adapt or strategize by producing fragmented utterances to speed up their production. And then there's also the idea that lexical accessibility or structural accessibility drives what is produced in agrammatism. These theories have the advantage of being a little more overarching, but then the confound is, the limitation is that they are not specific enough to the specific fine-grained patterns that you see in expressive agrammatism. So some of the challenges in understanding or moving forward with agrammatism include what I mentioned earlier, which is it's unclear if the symptoms are really unique to expressive agrammatism in post-stroke aphasia. We would like to identify a core symptom cluster, set of symptoms, in order to advance our theoretical understanding of expressive agrammatism. And we want to be sure that the symptoms differentiate agrammatic aphasia from other aphasias, non-agrammatic aphasias. As you'll see in the upcoming slides, a majority of these studies have actually compared agrammatic aphasia with neurotypical adults, which doesn't tell us much about agrammatism per se. It might tell us about the general impact of aphasia. It's also unclear if researchers are using consistent operational criteria for selecting participants with expressive agrammatism. In some studies, they use proxies such as non-fluent aphasia or Broca's aphasia without quite characterizing the grammatical impairment. A challenge has been there's an immense amount of work in the past 4 decades in the field of expressive agrammatism, but we don't quite yet have a clear picture across symptoms, especially when we consider the fact that the comparison group often has been neurotypical adults. So with that background, the aims of today's talk are, one, to examine the operational definition of agrammatism in past studies by conducting a systematic review, to propose a psychometrically robust minimum set of measures to identify agrammatism from a narrative language sample. This effort is not new in any way, and later on I'll explain how it's different from past approaches of identifying measures to identify agrammatism. And the third aim is to consolidate research findings to the extent that we can in a 45-minute talk to identify patterns that are unique to agrammatism. Again, paying particular attention to the comparison group. I think the robustness of our interpretation would depend on who the comparison group is. Okay, moving on to our first aim is to examine the operational definition of expressive agrammatism in post-stroke aphasia. So we identified research articles using keywords such as agrammatic or agrammatism. We screened those articles, their abstracts for availability of the full text. They had to be peer reviewed and they had to be focusing on post-stroke aphasia and not another condition such as Parkinson's disease or primary progressive aphasia. And then we coded those articles for how did they operationally define agrammatism if they did, what participant selection criteria did they use in their method section, and if they used a comparison group, what was the comparison group? A comparison group is not always necessary depending on the focus of the study, but when there was one, what kind of a group was it? So on to the results. In the introduction section, 90% of those 74 articles did define agrammatism. They used a variety of definitions, including syntactic comprehension problems, verb deficits, impaired sentence structure, and so on. But they definitely defined agrammatism in 90% of the cases. Now moving on to the method section of those papers, 1/4 of them, or 25%, just used clinical judgment in terms of their diagnosis of expressive agrammatism. The clinical judgment was often a referral by a speech pathologist in the hospital. 25% actually provided objective measures. There were a wide range of objective measures such as mean length of utterance, proportion of well-formed sentences, noun-verb ratio, and so on. There definitely emerged a somewhat of a common set of measures, including proportion of grammatical sentences. 40% of these articles actually used Broca's aphasia and expressive agrammatism synonymously and described the diagnostic characteristics of Broca's aphasia based on standardized aphasia tests. 27% of the articles did not provide any explicit criteria. They just mentioned that their participants had agrammatism. And in terms of the comparison group, out of these 74 articles, 58 had a comparison group. So they had another population in comparison. And in 80% of those cases, the comparison group was a neurotypical group, aged matched neurotypical adults. I use the term neurotypical to refer to neurologically healthy, non-stroke, age and education matched peers. So to summarize, there's considerable variability in how agrammatism is characterized across studies. And this is problematic in terms of constructing a theoretically coherent set of symptoms for agrammatism, as well as for replicability. It's also problematic when terms like Broca's and non-fluent aphasia are used as proxies for expressive agrammatism without explicitly demonstrating that the participants had expressive agrammatism. Especially non-fluent aphasia could include speech motor difficulties such as apraxia of speech, which often co-occur with expressive agrammatism. Given this, there's also, I think there's some uncertainty about what we exactly know about agrammatism, given the variability in how participants have been described and recruited across studies. And I'd like to highlight that the presence of a comparison group, which has aphasia but does not have expressive agrammatism, is important to delineate what is a general effect of aphasia versus a specific effect of a grammatical impairment. Now moving on to our second aim, which is to identify psychometrically robust minimum set of narrative language measures to differentiate agrammatism from non-agrammatic aphasia. Like I said, this is not a new venture. This has been done before. The first of this attempt was by Safran and colleagues in the quantitative production analysis, which is a method of coding narrative language, which has been used, by researchers throughout when they are interested in specific grammatical aspects of language. And most recently, a couple months ago, it has also been available. This analysis has been available through the clan utilities in TalkBank. Another aspect about the QPA is that these studies, the first three studies that are cited here, they actually compare agrammatic with non-agrammatic aphasic groups. So that's actually an advantage, given that they have used another comparison group of aphasia. There's also the Northwestern Narrative Language Analysis, which was developed in the mid-1990s. This is also available as a utility in clan utility in TalkBank. So they're both available for, not only manual coding, but also can be done through the TalkBank utilities. Both of these approaches do require coding of individual aspects of the narrative, such as whether a determiner was missing, the number of arguments that verb would take, whether all the arguments were coded, and so on. So there is some amount of manual coding that is required. And then, of course, there are the clan utilities in TalkBank. To those of you who are unfamiliar, TalkBank is a big data repository of aphasia language samples, both narratives as well as their corresponding test scores. And there is the vanilla general easy utility called eval, which spits out a whole bunch of measures such as the mean length of utterance, proportion of nouns, verbs, and so on. Of course, if you ran the eval kind of utility, you don't do any coding. You just, you just transcribe in good chat format, and then you get the values. Now, so how is the current approach different? Or how is it trying to extend what has already been done? The effort was to identify measures that don't require manual coding. So it saves time. It reduces the unreliability or the subjectivity of making inferences about what the intended target was. And the other difference is that we want to develop some psychometric criteria such as sensitivity and specificity. So we know the confidence with which these measures can identify agrammatic aphasia. So how did we go about this? We had three groups of participants. Two of these groups, the neurotypical adults as well as individuals with individuals with aphasia but not agrammatism, were extracted from the TalkBank database. The third group, the one with agrammatic aphasia, was taken from my own research participants. All three groups were matched for age and education. And then the two aphasic groups were matched for aphasia severity as measured by the aphasia quotient of the Western Aphasia Battery. We had narrative language samples based on the TalkBank protocol for all of these participants. These were transcribed and we ran the eval utility. Just to make sure that the agrammatic and the non-agrammatic aphasic groups where truly belonged to those categories, we conducted perceptual ratings proposed by Castillo and colleagues. And in that system, there are four measures that kind of capture agrammatism in a cluster analysis. And these were things like omission of brown morphemes, stereotypies, omission of free morphemes, and short utterances. To that, we also added something called dearth of verbs. So these were independently, these two groups were different in their perceptual ratings on those measures. Then we compared the eval output of measures across the three groups, and then also did pairwise comparisons, paying particular attention to the agrammatic versus non-agrammatic pairwise comparisons. And based on the significant comparisons between agrammatic and non-agrammatic, or based on theoretical interest, we selected measures and submitted them to a binary logistic regression modeling to identify which cluster of measures gave the best classification accuracy. By classification accuracy, we mean how well do those measures, that collection of measures, differentiate a group as, differentiate a participant as having agrammatism or not. And then we identified the best logistic regression model among the different models. We also conducted what is called an ROC analysis, which I'll explain later. This was used to extract sensitivity and specificity of these core measures. An ROC analysis gives you the predictive value of an individual predictor, whereas the logistic regression model does it for a cluster of predictors. And we use the ROC analysis to determine cutoff scores as what would be characterized as agrammatic or not. So here is a table showing just a sampling of the results. Obviously, the eval output gives you many more values. So each column is one language measure from the eval output. And the first three rows are the mean values for that measure for the three participant groups. And then the last three rows are the p-values, the probability values for the pairwise comparisons. So neurotypical versus non-agrammatic, neurotypical versus agrammatic, and in bold, the key pairwise comparison, which is non-agrammatic versus agrammatic. And this is just a sampling of the measures. As you can see, for example, MLU in morphemes, mean length of utterance in morphemes, and verbs per utterance did not reach significance in comparing agrammatic versus non-agrammatic groups. This is kind of interesting because one of the hallmark definitions of agrammatism is short utterances. But we see that even non-agrammatic people have short utterances when compared to neurotypical adults. Similarly, verbs per utterance is considered a measure of syntactic complexity and an indication that agrammatic people produce fewer verbs, didn't quite reach significant. On the other hand, we would love a measure like open to closed class ratio, where you see a solid difference between the two groups. In the fourth column, we have the percentage of bound morphemes used with verbs. This is totaled across several columns in the eval output. And again, did not quite reach significance. But people with agrammatic aphasia who speak English, they tend to do a lot of inging. A noun is verbing. Girl is running, Cinderella is running, boy is eating, stool is falling. So there's an overuse of ing forms. So if you exclude the ing forms and add up the other verb bound morphemes, you see that there's a robust difference. So this is just an illustration of the kinds of things we found. So, these are, good measures, the open closed class ratio of a morphology excluding ing. So now let's look at the logistic regression model. The best fitting model had a classification accuracy of almost 95%, which is quite strong. And that best fit model had 5 predictors. Lower values on verb inflections, excluding ing, lower values of MLU in morphemes, and somewhat approaching significance verbs per utterance were predictive of agrammatism, as were higher values on noun morphology. So noun morphology is the sum of determiners and plurals. And that was actually a very, very strong predictor. This tells us that we shouldn't be putting all functional morphemes into a single bucket, because you have high noun morphology versus low verb morphology. So they should be counted separately. Noun verb ratio was also part of this model, but it wasn't a significant predictor. You might wonder what would happen if we removed these two non-significant predictors, noun verb ratio and verbs per utterance. Then the classification accuracy goes down to 85%. So I kind of left them in the model. As a side note, the Casio ratings, which are ratings on a 1 to 4 scale, also had a fairly decent classification accuracy of 80%. Now moving on to the receiver operating curve analysis, which is a analysis of the predictive ability of individual predictors. by calculating the sensitivity, and it's a plot of the sensitivity and the specificity of a predictor. And here is an illustration of the verb inflection ROC. It's not much of a curve, it's a little bit jagged, but you kind of see the curviness of it. Sensitivity is how accurately does a measure identify somebody as having agrammatic aphasia when they actually have agrammatic aphasia. Specificity is how accurately does a measure identify somebody as not having agrammatic aphasia when they actually don't have agrammatic aphasia. So you can use the ROC curve to calculate what is called the area under the curve. So the area under the curve is the area under the blue line. Of course, the green line is a predictor that has no value, right? So it's a null hypothesis. So you want your blue line to be as far away from the null hypothesis. And usually a AUC, area under the curve, of 0.8 and above is considered good. So here again, you have the area under the curve for some individual measures, and you can use the sensitivity values to determine cutoff scores, right? So I selected a sensitivity value of 80% to determine what was the cutoff score, which you see in the middle column, and then also the specificity at that cutoff score. And you can see, the specificity is not so great for some of the measures, but quite good for some of the measures. So to summarize, psychometric criteria can be used to identify agrammatism in uncoded narrative language samples, right? So we didn't code anything, we just transcribed the samples. And the classification accuracy is high, it's almost 90%. The predictive value of individual predictors is good, but I don't call it excellent. If it was greater than 0.9, I would have said it's excellent. What are the next steps in this project? The next steps is actually, immediate next step is actually to reverse engineer it. That is, use an unselected sample of participants with aphasia or without aphasia, apply those cutoff scores that we got, and then verify if they were correctly classified. I'd also like to examine classification accuracy of the other kinds of narrative measures that do require coding. Maybe there's like one measure that has excellent predictive value, and that we don't need a cluster of measures to identify agrammatism. But I think there's a lot more to explore there. Now moving on to our final aim, which is to consolidate research findings to identify patterns that are unique to agrammatism, again, paying attention to the comparison group. There's a lot of research, and I must say that I wasn't able to cite everything, so no offense to anybody whose citations I missed out. So as a quick recap, the research on agrammatic aphasia in the past 4 decades, starting from the 1980s, has focused on these 4 themes. So I'll consider these individually, starting with sentences. So unlike spontaneous speech, where we kind of have to work with what the person with aphasia produces, studies of sentence structure in agrammatic aphasia have used very nice, clever elicitation paradigms to elicit very complex types of sentences. One of this is this constrained picture description paradigm, where there is an arrow or something indicating which word the sentence has to begin with. So this is designed to, in this case, trigger a passive sentence like the door is opened by the nurse. There are also structural priming paradigms that are used, where in this particular illustration, there is a prime, which is either heard or read by the participant. And I know the font is very small here, but the structural prime here is a passive sentence. The driver is poked by the boy. And then they describe a picture. And in this picture, the idea is that after having been presented with passive prime, participants are more likely to describe this picture with a passive sentence, like the man is poked by the woman. And so the proportion of passive sentences after a passive prime or a dative prime and so on are counted. So that's, again, a clever manipulation. Another paradigm that has been used is the use of anagrams. where you are presented with words on word cards, and the participant has to arrange them into a sentence. The advantage being that the load of lexical access is minimized given that the word cards are provided, and you actually get to test the actual grammatical competence of the person with aphasia. So what is their grammatical knowledge? Then there is a sentence completion paradigm where you are given a fill in the blank task or multiple choice kind of option. Now let's summarize what we know. First, talking about passive sentences. In the upcoming slides, you'll see tables that look very, have the same format. The first column summarizes the findings, and the second column gives an analysis of whether this is unique to agrammatism or not, and the third column gives the rationale for that conclusion. So passive sentences are found to be impaired in agrammatism. People with agrammatic aphasia produce actives for passives, such as the nurse is opening the door, or they produce role reversals, such as the door is opening the nurse, or they might, additionally, there might be absence of passive morphology like the was, auxiliary, as well as the by phrase. Now, the question is this unique to agrammatism? I say probably, meaning that the confidence is high, but not certain. And that was because in some studies, the comparison group was neurotypical. In studies where the comparison group was another group with aphasia, they also had trouble with passive sentences. So we're not too sure yet. Um, the other thing that has been found with passive sentences is that individuals with agrammatic aphasia are responsible to structural priming, like we saw in the poked example a couple slides ago, as well as lexical priming. Is this unique to agrammatism? No, other individuals are also found to respond to priming, including neurotypical adults since the 1990s. Hartsweeker, who's cited here, found a larger priming effect in people with aphasia compared to neurotypical adults, and concluded that people with aphasia have poor availability of sentence structure, and therefore they resort very heavily to using of the prime. In a more recent study of an unselected group of people with aphasia, that is, they were not just with agrammatic aphasia, Lee found, of course, priming, but the magnitude of priming was better or higher when you had better syntactic ability. Syntactic ability was measured through other standardized tests. So this doesn't seem to be something unique to agrammatism. So what can we say? It looks like several aphasia groups have trouble with passive sentences, although they might be due to different underlying problems, such as functional mapping or lexical access and so on. So, but you do see problems with passives elsewhere. The good news is that it doesn't look like there's a breakdown in grammatical encoding, because people with aphasia can be primed with a structural prime, showing that they do have access to grammatical encoding machinery. Now, moving on to other complex structures, the 80s and the 90s were filled with research on, especially the 90s, on production of various kinds of complex sentences. The idea being that most of these complex sentences required movement of elements from the basic deep structure, and therefore should be problematic for individuals with aphasia. The first row summarizes the findings on questions, WH questions, yes, no questions, and other kinds of questions. And basically, some of the problems here have been that there has been no comparison group in these studies, or they used neurotypical comparison groups who perform at ceiling. So it's not clear if this finding is unique to agrammatic aphasia based on the evidence we have so far. People with agrammatic aphasia have been reported to have fewer embedded clauses, but this is not unique to agrammatic aphasia because there are studies who find it in fluent aphasia as well. There have been other studies on a wide variety of non-canonical sentences across many languages. The same problem with either not having a comparison group or a neurotypical comparison group. Negative sentences may or may not be complex depending on the language. And again, we have a problem of the absence of comparison groups. Now moving on to actually simple sentences and not complex sentences. One of the findings, very classic findings from 1980s or even earlier, is the impaired word order in English or any other language. And they tend to rely on the more potent and lexically accessible elements. Well, what about this finding? It's probably present, but not certain, because many of these studies had a neurotypical comparison group or no comparison group. Um, Now, another finding in which they compared non-fluent and fluent individuals with aphasia, non-fluent being the proxy for agrammatic aphasia, they found an overuse of the canonical word order in a language. So people tend to overuse the most common word order in a language, and that's found in both all types of aphasia. Um, and then the question of whether agrammatic aphasia is sentence structure is facilitated by lexical accessibility. Yes, that's a finding, but it's not unique to agrammatism because it's found in other aphasias as well. There has been some really neat eye tracking work that shows that individuals with agrammatic aphasia incrementally plan the elements of a sentence. That's good, showing that they do, they're planning the sentence very methodically, but this is not unique to agrammatism. It's found in neurotypical individuals as well. So what can we conclude based on what we have? Word order is preserved. It's also preserved in anagram tasks and judgment tasks. Um, there's an overuse of, word order is preserved in anagram and judgments tasks. There's an overuse of canonical word order as a safe harbor. So the noun is verbing, would be an example in English. Now, this is just a thought out there, that is it possible that when we see word order problems, it's actually an outcome of multiple abandonments, right? So the person starts an utterance with the boy, abandons it because they can't retrieve the verb, and then they say the girl, abandons it. We don't know. It depends on how we segment our utterances. So it's possible that some of these word order errors are actually, something else, strategies used by the individual. Now we're moving on to narratives. In narratives, I'm focusing on the studies that have used quantitative production analysis, because these studies consistently had a non-agrammatic group as well. So they had a more general group of individuals with aphasia. Some of those findings these are QPA measures: lower sentence length, lower sentence elaboration, lower proportion of well-formed sentences, and lower sentence complexity. In these studies, these measures did not differentiate fluent versus non-fluent. That is, both groups had these measures compared to neurotypical adults. So it's not unique to agrammatism. Now, in terms of morphological errors, they do seem to be present, unique to agrammatism, because in some of these studies, they did a cluster or factor analysis to see how do the groups cluster together. And one of the groups did have, actually two of the groups in Roshan et al. Study had, a high level of morphological error. So this seems to definitely stand apart. There are also lower counts of free and bound morphemes in these studies. So Gordon, who also did a factor analysis of QPA measures, concluded, especially based on the findings in the first row here, that several of the measures in QPA, even though they were designed to capture grammatical well-formedness, really are reflecting fluency and aphasia severity, so more generic measures. Another thing that you see is the core features of agrammatism, such as morphological difficulties in free and bound morphemes, and then sentence structure difficulties, they tend to be of different severities in individual people. So now moving on to findings on morphology. A symptom of agrammatism that I'm most passionate about is that, we have sentences mark a wide variety of morphemes, both free morphemes, bound morphemes, which are either on nouns or on verbs, or in other languages, they might be on other lexical elements of the sentence, and the morphemes perform different functions. So what do we know about these findings? The first claim in the 1990s was that regular morphemes or regular verb inflections are more impaired than irregular verb inflections. A meta-analysis of over 100 participants actually showed that this is not the case. Regular and irregulars are just as severely impaired in individuals with agrammatic aphasia. Um, and the second row talks about tense errors, and the pattern that tense and aspect errors, both of which mark time or degree of completion, are more common than agreement errors. Now, our rating for that is probably because the evidence is quite strong, although there are trouble with the comparison groups showing this, that some of the comparison groups are neurotypical or there wasn't a comparison group. There's also the idea of whether tenses are different in terms of their difficulty, and a meta-analysis again showed that that is not the case. What about lower counts of bound and free morphemes? That seems to be a fairly unique finding to agrammatism. And the confidence comes from the fact that when you have a comparison group of non-agrammatic aphasia, you kind of see that this is what differentiates the two groups. There's an overuse of frequent bound morphemes. This we're not too sure yet. I mean, there's a lot of ing in English narratives, and there's another study, Faroqi-Shah and Thompson in 2004, that showed that individual people have an individual favorite morpheme. Like some people produced past tense across the board and so on. But again, these studies do not have a comparison group that was non-agrammatic aphasic, or this pattern was not replicated in some studies. That is a frequency effect was not replicated in another study. In terms of morphology, they've also done grammaticality judgment tasks, and these grammaticality judgments have been of sentences that have violated morphosyntactic constraints. And that finding, and people do well in those tasks. And that finding, of course, is not unique to agrammatism because many groups show good judgment of morphosyntactic violations. There are also studies that have looked at morphosemantic violations where the meaning of the morpheme has been violated, such as yesterday the man will go to the store, right? And those, they do have trouble with judgment of those. And the rating for that is probably mainly because the comparison groups either do not exist or they have been a neurotypical group. But the rating is not sure, which is low, but probably because these studies have shown a dissociation within the same group. That is, within the same group, morphosyntactic judgment is good, morphosemantic judgment is poor. So overall, what can we conclude about morphology? What we are consistently seeing with some confidence is the presence of tense errors, the presence of lower counts of free and bound morphemes. Of course, in some languages, you can't quite eliminate the bound morpheme because that results in a non-word. So we are really, this is a kind of English dominant view. Now, moving on to the third theme in agrammatic research has been the dearth of verbs and difficulty with verbs. One pattern, classic pattern from the 1980s, is this noun-verb dissociation. That is, verbs are more impaired than nouns. Now, this pattern, although was very sensational when it was first described, is not unique to agrammatism. A large meta-analysis by Madzig and colleague with over 275 people showed that that was actually the most prominent pattern across aphasia types in picture naming studies. And then spontaneous speech analyses has not shown this to be inherently associated with agrammatism. The second finding regarding verbs is on the semantic complexity of verbs. So heavy verbs are semantically complex and more specific, such as bake or grill or trot. And light verbs are a small class of very highly frequent verbs that occur in a wide range of syntactic and semantic contexts, such as go, take, make. Now, the finding that heavy verbs are better preserved than light verbs, the rating is probably because the comparison groups have been other aphasias without agrammatism, or there have been dissociations found within the same group, where heavy being better than light. Now, moving on to the other aspect, the third aspect of investigations on verbs has been to do with verb argument structure. The idea being that verbs, agrammatic aphasic individuals, selectively have more difficulty with verbs with a more complex argument structure, and they prefer a simpler argument structure. Now, this has not been unique to agrammatism. The comparison group is in some cases neurotypical, or there's no comparison group, or the pattern is found in all aphasia types. This particular analysis of aphasia bank data from Malutina and colleagues actually found that across all aphasias, there was a preference for simpler argument structure. And in fact, when you looked at subtypes of aphasias and used, say, Broca's aphasia as a proxy for agrammatic aphasia, they, unlike other groups, produced transitive and intransitive verbs equally often, whereas the rest of the aphasic individuals produced intransitive verbs more often. Another finding is that verbs are produced as lexical elements, but all their arguments are not realized, or verbs are used in less diverse ways, not in very, they're used in a very strict, monotonous way. That finding seems again to be unique to agrammatism, coming from the Malutina study. So overall, the most consistent findings are an inverse relationship between light verbs and syntactic competence. I didn't quite explain that in the second row here, but there has been a relationship between light verbs. So people who produce more light verbs tend to have better syntactic competence. And then an incomplete production of verb arguments is also a consistent finding that you find across agrammatic aphasia. Moving on to the final aspect, which is grammaticality, judgment, and syntactic comprehension. Remember, our focus is on expressive agrammatism. So some people have, initially had claimed that expressive agrammatism and receptive agrammatism are inherently co-occur together. And basically, there's I'm citing two studies here. One is a grammaticality judgment study on a large group of individuals with aphasia. And they found that impaired difficulty with judging grammaticality is not associated with any specific aphasia subtype. Similarly, there's comprehension of complex versus simple sentences. The idea being that complex sentences judgment comprehension is selectively impaired in individuals with agrammatic aphasia. That also has not been replicated because other studies have also found, other aphasic individuals also find this pattern, as well as individuals who are neurotypical show this pattern as well under adverse listening condition. So expressive agrammatism is not inherently tied to receptive difficulties, although these could co-occur. So to summarize, based on our three aims, there are inconsistencies in how agrammatism is operationally defined across studies, contributing to some unknown variability across studies, as well as challenging replication of findings. Psychometric criteria can be used to identify agrammatism in uncoded narrative language samples, right? That's the key here, where we just let the measures organically emerge and did not do any coding of the language samples. The classification accuracy is high. The predictive value of the individual predictors was good. Finally, the most consistent findings unique to expressive agrammatism are limited verb inflections with the exclusion of ing, short sentences with overuse of canonical word order, tense errors, a tendency to use heavy verbs with incomplete argument structure. So now, how do we move forward? I think we need to be more conscientious about, explicitly stating the clinical criteria in defining our participants and, providing the language measures so that it helps us know who we are comparing across studies. We would encourage the use of a non-agrammatic aphasic comparison group to delineate what is the core characteristic of agrammatic aphasia versus a general aphasia impairment. Again, just throwing it out there, it's not clear whether grammatical difficulties are on a continuum or agrammatic aphasia is a very unique syndrome with none of the other aphasia clusters having any grammatical problems. I think moving forward, we need to probably use more fine-grained measures, such as durational measures and fluency measures, especially at the juncture of phrase production, word production, to see what are the challenges online as this is happening. And again, there are some really nice eye tracking studies that have been done looking at sentence production in individuals with agrammatic aphasia. You can do that probably without eye tracking as well by looking at durational measures in narrative speech and seeing whether there are longer pauses before certain elements, indicating a greater processing load at that time or a greater planning load at that time. The citation that I have here is, one that has associated disfluencies such as ums and ahs with specific kinds of difficulties in syntactic and lexical encoding. The lesions associated with agrammatic expressive agrammatism are, adjacent to neural regions that that implement a lot of cognitive processes. So it's important to look at the interaction between these cognitive processes and agrammatic production. So for example, is difficulty with sentence planning associated with difficulty with making selections among different phrase structure types, which could be an outcome of poor cognitive control? Is it possible that people abandon their utterances and restart their utterances because of limitations in verbal working memory, for example? Or maybe that has the limitations in verbal working memory affect how you can produce long distance dependencies in sentences. So that concludes my presentation, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Yasmeen. That was a lovely talk. First of all, thank you also for digging through that whole body of literature and for coming up with a cool analysis of, or an attempt at a cool analysis, right? To figure out what is consistent and what comparison groups were used, for example. We have a wealth of questions, so I'm just going to get straight into it. First question is from Lorraine Obler. When you gave an example of overuse of ing, the several examples you have all included, the copula is. He is walking, she is seeing, etc. No, one often sees the copula omitted too in more severe agrammatism, right? So also, did you distinguish between copula and non-copular verbs in your verb counts, regular and irregular morphology, especially for verb tense in English, and light from regular verbs? In Wernicke's aphasia and mid-stages of Alzheimer's disease, for example, many more light verbs are seen relative to contentful ones.
Yes, great question. And I think, different studies have coded the copula differently. Some of them, of course, well, in the it's a copula when you don't have a main verb, right? So in is inging, it's considered an auxiliary. But yes, studies have varied in terms of whether they counted the is, they separately delineated the use of the is as a copula or an auxiliary of the verb. So there are differences across that. And I do agree that there are some people, including individuals with Alzheimer's disease, as well as individuals with Wernicke's aphasia, where they have lexical problems, that there is an overuse of the light verbs. And that's why that particular feature was rated as probably, which is kind of a positive rating.
Thank you. You have I mean, most of your talk was actually about the topic that I had a question on, but I still wonder if maybe even your own analysis also suffers from the same challenge. So one challenge we run into consistently when we're trying to identify markers or predictors of agrammatism is the circularity that arises due to the absence of a gold standard, right? We just don't agree. Not everybody agrees on what agrammatism is. So does it include the comprehension problem? How central are the morphosyntactic reductions? And if you give a definition, A, of the group, characteristics, and then label that group by that definition, and then show that everybody in the group meets the exhibit, that of course is not informative. So in your case, I think you said in the beginning that the dearth of verbs was part of a perceptual rating to identify the agrammatic speakers. But if it turns out that that is not actually a core behavior, how do you solve that problem? Another way to look at it is to say, okay, we see that in fluent patients, they also reduce sentence complexity. So then you can say, okay, so that means it's not specific to agrammatism. Another way to look at that would be to say those fluent speakers also have agrammatism.
Good point. Yes, there is the circularity between, identifying agrammatism in a study that is meant to, identify diagnostic features of agrammatism. Like, how do you first diagnose agrammatism? So, good question. And I think what we did here is we utilized the Casio ratings, right? So dearth of verbs I added, but later on, once I ran the statistical analysis, I realized that that really wasn't quite capturing anything. Because dearth of verbs is not in the original Casio article. I added it thinking that, of course, agrammatics should have a dearth of verbs. So I added that. Now, in the Casio ratings, they have, so we use those independent ratings, and Casio's perceptual ratings, they went through a cluster analysis. They found clusters of behaviors, and this cluster, which they called agrammatism, identified a subgroup of individuals with aphasia. So that's why they named it that cluster. Within that cluster too, stereotypies was not something that individual predictor was not something that differentiated the two groups, the non-agrammatic and the agrammatic, because both groups seem to produce stereotypies. Yeah.
Great, thanks. Yeah, I think the cluster analysis is really an interesting approach here.
Mm-hmm.
Danielle Fahey asks, how would language typology affect the characterization of agrammatism cross-linguistically? So if you can say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, the field of agrammatic aphasia has been very rich with cross-linguistic data from a wide variety of languages. And so that has been really good. But that has also, I think, muddied the water a little bit because each language has a different, a typology. The canonical form might be different in different languages. The underlying linguistic structure is different in different languages. So when you try to draw broad comparisons or generalizations across languages, we tend to end up being overwhelmed and confused because there are unique patterns. I think what we really need to go forward is in one language, whichever your language is, try to identify all those aspects, right? So what is the situation with verbs? What's the situation with morphemes? What's the situation with sentence structure? And kind of empirically derive the core features. And I think that should be done on a language specific basis. I think we lose some clarity there is advantage to making cross-linguistic comparisons, because in the end, agrammatic aphasia shouldn't be language specific. But then I think we are at a point where we need to know what are these core symptoms. And there I feel it's going deep into a language rather than looking at broad sweeps across languages might be a better approach. But there are different ways of addressing the problem.
Great, thank you. Next question is from Eckhard Rupp. How did you define parts of speech, especially nouns and verbs? So did you use a proxy like object words are nouns, action words are verbs, or did you also take into account morphological and or phrasal contexts?
Mm-hmm. So in the AIM2, where we looked at the measures, language measures to diagnose agrammatic versus non-agrammatic aphasia, we relied on the output that came from the eval utility of clan, EVAL, eval utility of clan. And eval, from what I understand, uses the neighboring words, the context of the neighboring words to delineate if something that's homophonous between a noun or a verb is a noun or a verb. And of course, with aphasic samples, there might be a small margin of error with that.
Great, thanks. We have a question from one of our recent speakers. Davida From says, great talk, so interesting. I agree that describing how the expressive agrammatic aphasia group was diagnosed and defined is critical and somewhat problematic in much of the literature. Your work is obviously focused on helping clinicians and researchers do this in a more valid and reliable fashion. I also agree that having a non-agrammatic aphasia comparison group is important. My questions: how important is it to know the characteristics of the non-agrammatic non-agrammatic aphasia comparison group in studies looking at group differences? What characteristics would be most important to ascertain, for example, traditional aphasia classification types? I would imagine results, group comparisons, could differ a lot based on the composition of the non-agrammatic aphasia comparison group. How were the 25 non-agrammatic participants selected for your study, besides matching age, sex, and severity, and what else can you tell us about them?
Sure, wonderful. So yes, the comparison group is important. And I think if one take-home message that we have today at the end of this talk is that, a comparison group is very important. Now, the question is, what makes them non-agrammatic? Because the key difference really here is you have agrammatism or you don't have agrammatism. Of course, as you know, in my concluding slide, I questioned whether we should make such strong assumptions as, there's the agrammatic people and then there's the rest of the world. I do question that, and I'm not making a strong case for it either way. But the question here is, what is it about the non-agrammatic group, right? What made them into that group? And the idea based on the Casio ratings is they did not score high on any of these syntactic cluster, agrammatic cluster measures, presence of stereotypies, presence of omission of bound morphemes, omission of free morphemes, and short utterances. So we use the outside perceptual ratings to distinguish the two groups. We also avoided anybody who had a aphasia classification of Broca's aphasia. And most of our clients had the participants either had anomic aphasia, conduction aphasia, mixed aphasia, and so on. But I think severity definitely plays a role, because we know that grammatical well-formedness improves with the mildness of the aphasia. So you do want to match for overall severity. The next question is by Danielle Fahey. She is asking whether anybody does research on paragrammatism by bilingual speakers. I have found nothing in the literature is her question. I think the best produced work on paragrammatism most recently is by Machin, but again, that focuses on English. And I haven't seen anything either on paragrammatism in bilingual speakers.
And William Machin is her postdoc advisor. So there you go, Danielle.
Lorraine says, thank you for the super synthesizing of the work, especially from you and your lab on agrammatism, focusing on what is exactly crucial to the phenomenon by selecting PWA with no agrammatism. I also applaud your reminding us that 0.05 is a very arbitrary cutoff. So we'd be tempted to say p-values of 0.07 or 0.08 are non-significant. More sophisticated analysis tell us that factors such as p-values reflect, do in fact contribute to discriminating between the two crucial groups. That's true. I think, the 0.07, many of us who work with small groups, a p-value of 0.07, right? Many of us who work with small groups are sometimes tempted to say, if I had 5 more participants, this would have pushed it this way or that way. Now, just to give an example of the measures that I selected, verbs per utterance in differentiating between agrammatic and non-agrammatic individuals reached a p-value of 0.07. But I included it in the logistic regression model anyway because of like a theoretical significance of the association between verb deficit and agrammatism. So sometimes I didn't quite regard the p-value just because there was a theoretical significance. The next question is by Sylvia. A wonderful talk. Thank you very much. I wonder if you think that these factors will still be predictive enough when languages other than English are evaluated and when cases of, for instance, mixed aphasias are evaluated. There's quite a strong bias in the literature. A very good question about what measures would be relevant in other languages. And I really think we need to organically come up with the measures for that individual language because we are not yet at a point where we can make some sweeping statements about agrammatism if we want to empirically derive our language measures. Spud says, this is a wonderful talk. I'd like to ask a little more about the typology aspect if possible. How would this kind of research be affected by types of languages such as more polysynthetic or agglutinating languages where grammaticality is processed? I think in languages where you don't have these many free morphemes, right, and you were mostly having bound morphemes, I think there we would need to code. The account of morphemes would not differentiate between the two groups. In those studies, in those languages, what we see is that the morphemes are produced because they need to be produced for grammatical well-formedness, but the morphemes are inaccurate, right? So in those languages, you really do need to code the accuracy of the morpheme to extract certain measures. These measures, especially, the number of free morphemes would not work. That was the last question.
Wow, so you got through all of them. Thank you, Yasmeen. That was a wonderful talk. Thanks to our audience for sticking with us this season. We hope you have enjoyed all the talks. Well, you must have. And we're looking forward to seeing all of you back in August when we restart for the next season of the C-Star lecture series. One final reminder, May 15th is a deadline for submissions to the Academy of Aphasia. We're looking forward to all your work. Thank you again, Dr. Faroqi-Shah, for your talk, and have a great summer, everyone.
Thank you for having me. Bye.